Well, good morning again. I'm excited to be here with you this morning, and I have some thoughts on my mind and a question I want to ask you. The question is also the title of the message for this morning. Are people really being helped? I think of the things that are going on in our world today with the hurricane and the destruction, and I ask that question, are people really being helped? I think of our recent outreach to the community around us where we gathered water and we took it down to those who are working so tirelessly in the communities that were affected. And the question I ask again is, are people really being helped? And I notice as we come in, we're trying to gather some more water because the struggle continues. And you might say to yourself, well, the water's back on, the power's back on, they don't need that stuff. But the truth is they still need assistance. They still need help. They still need to feel like God is working through someone who even cares about them. And the question keeps coming up, are people really being helped? This morning we're going to investigate another story. A story where Jesus was a healer. A story about 10 lepers. It was a terrible thing to contract leprosy in those days. Well, it'd be a terrible thing to contract leprosy or any major illness anytime. Today, then. But in those days, by law, because this disease was so contagious and almost always seemed to be fatal, the individuals were cast out of their homes. They had to leave their families. They were cast out and became outcasts of society. However, even in those places where they were living in isolation together, because they formed what was referred to as leper colonies, right? People with that same illness that were together, dying together. They had heard of Jesus. They had heard of the healing powers of God walking amongst us. And it was worth a chance, wasn't it? They also heard that Jesus was coming near them. So they gathered on the edge of this colony, and I'm envisioning in my mind there's a black line that just goes all the way around this area. Maybe it was a fence. Maybe it was a chain link fence. Maybe it was a pile of rocks. Maybe it was nothing except don't leave. And they gathered on the edge of that and they called out to Jesus. They were looking for not only mercy but healing. And they got his attention. And Jesus came to them, those who were fatally ill, those who were so caught up with what was happening in their world and to their body that they had these questions on their mind. Does God even care about me? Does God even hear me when I call out, when I pray? Does God even know that I exist? Those questions aren't unique to the lepers of those colonies, are they? Those questions are questions that you and I may talk about because we all wonder, does God care about me? Does God even hear me when I pray? Does God even know that I exist? And the answer that is so relevant and so clear from the story that is told about the healing power of Jesus Christ is a resounding yes. God does care. God does hear. God knows you exist. But don't you hear very faintly, very softly, very lovingly a response from God? If you know that I care. If you know that I hear your prayers. If you know that I know you. Why not show just a little attitude of gratitude? Why not turn it around and show love? Let me know, God says, that you hear me, that you care for me, that you know that I even exist, because sometimes I feel God pain because some don't know, hear, care. We, every week, go through different versions of the Bible to make sure that it's the one that tells the story the most easy for you to understand. And this week, Eugene Peterson's message tells us in a very unique way. It is the 17th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. It picks up where we left off last week. It is the 11th verse through the 19th. It happened that he made his way towards Jerusalem. He crossed over the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 men, all lepers, met him. They kept their distance, but they raised their voices, calling out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Taking a good look at them, he said, "Go, show yourself to the priest." And they went, and while they were on their way, they became clean. One of them, when he realized that he was healed, turned around and came back shouting his gratitude, glorifying God. He kneeled at Jesus' feet, so grateful. He couldn't thank Jesus enough. And he was a Samaritan. And Jesus said, "Were there not 10 healed? Where are the 9? Can none be found to come back and give glory to God except this outsider?" Then he said to the one that returned, "Get up, on your way. Your faith has healed and saved you." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
You have to understand, you have to hear with your ears as well as your hearts and your minds what was going on in those communities in those days. Not so different than many places in our world today where there's illness and death and tragic situations. The lepers, by law, were banned from their society. They had to forfeit their job. They could no longer live with their families. They couldn't shop at Publix. They couldn't even take a walk with a friend. Isolated. They were not even allowed to come into the back row of the church and worship. They had to reside a safe distance away from other people. We see pictures of what it was probably like. I put one in the bulletin today. It looks like they take cheesecloth and wrap around all of their body so that the only thing that is open, just a little slit for their eyes, a little place for their mouth. They had to cover up. And if anybody came near them, they were required to say, "I am a leopard," a leper, not a leopard. "I am a leper and I am unclean. Stay your distance." Because you see, they were considered the walking dead. It was their fate. Walking dead. I was surprised the first time I read this passage, this story that Luke shares with us about things that were going on when Jesus was here and healing and preaching and loving people. I was surprised because if I had placed myself in that situation with a fatal death mark, and Jesus healed me with just a word from his mouth. I'm thinking of these lepers. They're wrapped in bandages all over, and pieces of their body are just falling off, and they're, oh my gosh, it would have been terrible. And to know that just the word from Jesus and I leave that place, head towards the priest in town. By the time I get there, well, I'm thinking of what I look like in heaven. You may not recognize me. I no longer have those horn-rimmed glasses that I had when I had hair. The robe that I will be wearing will be much smaller. I won't have wings, but I'll have the voice of an angel. And I'll know every word to every song. When they arrived at the priest, he could do nothing but say to the person, I have inspected you. You are clean. You are free to go back to your life, to your family, to your friends, to your job. Ten of them were in that little colony. 10 of them were healed by the healing power of Jesus' voice. And only one came back to thank Jesus, to thank God. And he was a Samaritan. You remember the story, the clash between the Samaritans and the Jews. And yet it was what Jesus referred to as an outsider, a foreigner, was the one that came back, not the one of their community. I found this cute story. I think you'll like it. A man was working construction, and in the process of his daily working, he hurt his thumb. I mean, hurt it. And so he went to the supervisor, the foreman of the job, and he said, boy, I really did it this time. He says, I don't know. He says, I know it hurts so bad, I don't think I can work this afternoon. The foreman said to him, go to the clinic right now. Tell them what happened. Tell them who you work for. Our clinic will take care of you. And so he went to the clinic that was just around the corner. Told them as he walked up, and they said, well, just go over to that door. And the man opened the door, and he walked in, and there's this small room with a desk and two chairs. And behind that desk were 2 nameplates over the doors. One said illness, the other said injury. So he looks at his thumb, he says, well, I'm not sick, I just hurt my thumb. So he went over to the door that says injury. And he went through that door marked injury, and it opened up into a room that had a desk with 2 chairs and 2 doors behind it with a thing over the top that said internal or external. And he looks at his thumb and he goes, that's not internal, that's external. So he goes to the door that says external. By now his thumb is really throbbing. I need some help. So he goes through the door that says internal. And he opens the door and it goes into a room with, you guessed it, a desk and 2 chairs with 2 doors behind it. And over the door, one says therapy and one says treatment. He says, well, I may not need therapy now, but I may need it if this continues. He says, so I'm going to go into the door marked treatment. And once again, he entered this room with a desk, 2 chairs, 2 doors, and above the doors, one says minor and major. He looks down at his thumb and he goes, it's probably minor, but it's starting to feel like major. So he went through the door that's marked minor. When he opens the door, he steps out, closes the door behind him, he turns around and he looks, and guess what?
He's outside.
He's outside. No more doors and rooms with tables and chairs. He's outside. And so he looks at his thumb, he goes back to work, and his supervisor says, well, did they help you? And he goes, well, I'm not real sure, but I've never seen a place that was so organized. organization is a wonderful thing, but the question that we ask ourselves over and over today is, are the people really being helped? Now, take that little story, as silly as it may seem, apply it to the church. Apply it here if you choose. Are people, through the doors and bells and whistles and openings that we offer to people, are they really being helped? When Jesus sent the lepers to the priest, by the time they reached the priest, they were healed. He says, show yourself, be examined, be released, be freed, be saved from the dreaded disease of our day. I keep going back to that same thought that I have. Wouldn't you be joyful? Wouldn't you be grateful? Wouldn't you return and say, thank you? Praise God. What was is no longer, and I am someone new. And like Jesus, I question, where are the 9? Now think about this. Saying thank you is kind of a thing that separates human beings from the animal kingdom. You know, animals can't come back to you and say thank you. They love us. They constantly love us, but they don't come back and say thank you. Saying thank you is kind of a statement of grace. It's often pride that is inside of us that keeps us from confessing our thanks to another. Basically a humbling thing, isn't it? To have to go back and thank another individual for something they've done. We get blinded by life. We start finding ourselves not willing to reach out in an attitude of gratitude. Sometimes we just think we're above that. I'm a good person. I deserve to be healed. I don't even need a Band-Aid. I can heal this on my own. I can do what it takes to make it better all by myself. And you know, life is like that. I'm just going to allow the good part of life just to come to me. Giving thanks is a statement of character. It's a statement of grace. It's a statement of worship if you think about it in detail. Build your daily routine around a time when you thank God for the blessings. Because sometimes even the smallest blessings we should give praise to God. Sometimes we have major blessings in our lives where things work out, things happen because of God's involvement in our life, and we should stop every day and thank God for just that, for God's presence. Because I'm here to tell you that nothing in life is happenstance. I don't believe there's anything that we would really be able to call a coincidence. I found another little story. A story about 2 men, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Thompson. And they were both very seriously ill. They were in the hospital and sharing a room together. And because of the seriousness of their illness, they were not allowed to have any excitement. No visitors, no radio, no television. So the only entertainment, the only thing that kept them sane at all was each other's company. They were able to talk to themselves. And Mr. Thompson was on the, I guess you'd call it bed A, next to the door. And his illness made him lay flat, not to move. He had to heal by remaining rigid and still. Mr. Wilson was kind of the opposite of that. For an hour a day, the nurses would come in and help Mr. Wilson sit up. And for an hour a day, he was required to sit up. Mr. Thompson, on the other hand, was required all day to lay down. Now, if you picture the standard hospital room. We have bed A and bed B. So bed B, where Mr. Wilson was right next to the window. And then every day when the nurses came in and they propped Mr. Wilson up, they would share the gift of conversation. Because Mr. Wilson would tell Mr. Thompson, "Let me tell you what's going on outside of our window." One day, he described, when I look out, he says, there's this beautiful park with a little lake in the middle, and there are ducks and there are swans, and the children are playing around and offering bread to the ducks and the swans. And some others are sailing model boats in the little lake. And Mr. Thompson's heart is just touched by the scene that he's being described. Another time when Mr. Wilson is propped up and he's looking out the window and he's saying to Mr. Thompson, "Oh, today I can see the field. There's a baseball game going on and the young children are playing." He said it's just a wonderful thing to see. And off to the side, he says, there's a little bit of a breeze and they're flying colorful kites in the air. And let me tell you about the green of the trees, the colors of the flowers. Oh, not only are the cars pulling up around the park, you remember that horse-drawn carriage that takes people through the park? It's all shined and perfect, and the horse is white as snow. One day, Mr. Thompson shares with Mr. Wilson that there's a parade going on. And he described the parade in detail, great detail, with every float, every costume, every uniform, every flag. But then as it happened, Mr. Thompson, after listening all this time about what was going on outside of their window, started to think, how did I end up in bed A? How come I wasn't the one that could turn my head enough to look out the window and see these beautiful things? And every moment from that point on, he started to get bitter and upset and angry. And he was upset with Mr. Wilson, not because he was sharing the beautiful things, but because he could. He was telling him all the wonderful things going on, and Mr. Thompson thought that he should be the one seeing and telling of what was happening. Well, it wasn't long after that Mr. Wilson died. And they came and took his body out of the room, and Mr. Thompson waited for a little while to where it would not seem harsh, but can you trade beds with me? Can I be moved to the bed over by the window? And they said, well, sure. And so they placed him in the bed and they laid him flat on his back because he couldn't move, remember? And they walked out and the nurses closed the door, and he couldn't wait for them to leave because he could turn his head just enough to look out the window to see all the wonderful things that Mr. Wilson had told him. To great surprise, the scene was a red brick wall. A blank wall that blocked the view of everything. Sometimes love is more powerful when it surprises us. I want you to try something over the next few days between now and next week. In the Spirit of Jesus, be very creative and surprise somebody with your love, your compassion. The way that Jesus surprised with the healing of the lepers. Jesus was really good at showing love in a very surprising way. And we can do too. That story was from Bishop Moore from a day gone by. But it's relevant today. That's when Jesus healed the lepers. And all the children say,
Amen.